So Scrum, this is software developers role-playing rugby. Does anyone here play rugby? I've never played, so I've never been in a Scrum. But apparently, a Scrum is the huddle, kind of like in football, I suppose. Well, actually, I never played football either, so I really no idea about that either. But the huddle where a bunch of rugby players will get together, surround the ball. The ref or somebody drops the ball into the middle, and they all try and fight to get the ball. So that's essentially the word Scrum. It's the kickoff of a rugby match. All right. So anyway, so we're going to talk about Agile. So what is Agile development? What is the Agile development model? This is, in essence, a set of principles that arose from a bunch of people who got together in a room in Utah and tried to hash out, what's going on with their software project. What they emerged with after a very short time, apparently, it didn't take them very long, was the Agile Manifesto. So there's a written manifesto that is this. This is it. This is the whole thing. If anyone asks you, do you know what Agile development is? Well, this is it. There's nothing else. We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value, and they're indicating here, things they value more than other things. So individuals and interactions over processes and tools, meaning the dialogue between client and developer, customer and developer, and so on, is more important than some formal process or some formal set of tools. So in other words, informality. They value informality over formality. Working software over comprehensive documentation. In other words, they'd rather get the job done, well, than have to sit around writing huge amounts of documentation and lots of specification documents. What they're trying to say is jump into implementation as fast as possible. Leave the specification phase as lightweight as possible. All right, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So you've got the idea that, again, interactive dialogue rather than trying to make these legalese documents. Every project has to involve money, has to involve time. There has to be a commitment that the company that makes the software will do it within a certain budget and so on. So these documents, to negotiate a contract that accounts for every possible way that the project could go wrong, that takes lawyers and lots of time and discussion. And they're saying, we'd rather just have a good relationship with the client rather than negotiating that contract to death. Responding to change over following a plan. Again, this is going to the specification idea, right? Don't get stuck on the specification. If the specification isn't working out for you, fix it, change it, do something different in your implementation. Don't spend all this huge amount of effort trying to think of every possible thing you need to do up front. Try and just figure out a process, a way you can do your work where you can quickly respond to changes in what's happening. So these are the preferences: individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. And that is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. And that's it. That's the Agile Manifesto. And I've given you a link here to the actual document that you can click through. There's a second document they wrote, which is just kind of a larger explanation about some of this stuff. So you have a more proper write-up, maybe 2 pages of text written up about this. And that's pretty much it. So when people talk about Agile software development and as if it's a very worked out process that has to follow certain rules, well, this is it. It's 4 bullet points. There's nothing here about how to do it, really. It's just about a preference for the things on the left versus the things on the right. Not to say you're not going to have the things on the right, because of course you will. And not to say you're always going to get the things on the left, although you want them. But this is the balance that they're trying to skew to the left of this bullet pointed list. Okay, so there you go. That is the Agile Manifesto. And a few people could really argue with that. It's pretty simple enough that it just makes some common sense. And it meets the experiences of most developers, where there's huge amounts of effort spent in specification and coming up with contracts that make sure that promises are exactly outlined in the contracts, outline exactly what's going to be built, and that has to be specified up front. And that's a huge amount of effort. But then, of course, things go wrong in the middle. And how do you deal with that? When things go wrong in the middle, but your contract says you have to do X, Y, and Z, but you're realizing you have to do A, B, and C instead, there's no room for changing your path if your contract is so rigid. So this is the concept here of Agile. All right, so that was the deal, and there's no real detail of how to do that. And people often like to follow a plan. So lots of people popped up with various ways to implement the Agile vision. processes, steps you can go through as a team to get to a world where you're getting those things on the left of that list more than the things on the right. Scrum is one of those. It's by no means the only one, but it's one of those frameworks, as they call themselves, to implement the Agile principles. All right, so what is the Scrum framework? Scrum is a recipe for achieving Agile development by prescribing a strict set of a few things. Roles. Every individual on a team involved in a project has a specific role that they are playing. Events. There are specific events that have to take place during the course of a project. Meetings and things like that. That specific kinds of meetings that serve a specific purpose that have to be taking place at certain times in the project. Artifacts. These are documents or produced materials, slideshows, documents, written up text, videos, whatever it is. There are certain artifacts that must be made, things that must be made and shared at specific stages of the process as well. And let's dive into each one of those on its own. So we'll talk about the roles first, the events second, the artifacts third, and that is going to give you a flavor for what Scrum is all about. All right, so roles. So there are 4 distinct roles. That means every single person involved in a project is one of 4 roles. Imagine you're an actor playing a role. This is what it is. There's the product owner. We'll talk more about what that is. There's the Scrum Master and the developer and stakeholders. That's it. So what is the product owner? I think my next slide goes into that a little bit more. But a product owner, in a nutshell, is the person who represents the business interests of the project. The person who has the vision of why the project is being done in the first place. Is it to increase revenue? Is it to attract more users? Is it to collect email addresses? Whatever that reason is why you're making something, the product owner has that in their head, and everything that they do is kind of focused on getting that business goal achieved. The Scrum Master is the one who is responsible for remembering how Scrum works. So what the rules of Scrum say to do at any given moment. That's the Scrum Master. They embody the Scrum process. And the developer, those are the people writing the code. We all know what developers are. They write the code and get the work done. And stakeholders, we've already discussed. Stakeholders are anyone who has a say in the outcome of a project. So all the VIP customers, all the client executives and client team that you interact with when you're in a development team, and anyone else who can get their fingers in the project and really change what it does because they're that important to the project. Those are stakeholders. So it's possible, although not usually advisable, for one person to be in more than one of these roles. You could have a developer also be the product owner. You could have a developer also be a stakeholder. You could have a developer also be a Scrum Master, right? So you can have a single people playing more than one role, but at any given moment when they're doing a certain task, they should be doing it with one of these roles in mind. Product owner, as we mentioned, they represent the business interests within the team. They're part of the team making the software. They're traditionally not developers, although in our case, they will be. And they're the ones who communicate with the client. So let's say you are making software, what was the example we just used? You're making software for Chase Bank to help with their wealth management services. The product owner would be the only one who has, or the main one who has meetings with the client. There are many reasons for this, but this is the person who has the client's interests in their head. What does the client want? The client maybe wants, software that allows them to see clients' investments in a dashboard with some nice graphs. Let's say that's the goal. The product owner will have that vision in their head that everything that we're doing here is to get graphs on the screen so a wealth management advisor can advise their client and show them the charts. And that's their main focus. They remember that that's the goal, and they try and get everyone else focused on achieving that goal in the project. They also elaborate on that goal to developers and to other people on the team who maybe don't understand it very well. So they are there to translate the business needs to the other people involved in the team, but also vice versa to translate the things that are happening internally in the team to the client. So they're kind of the bridge between client and developer. They are a team member who maintain and prioritizes a list of features to be implemented. They're the ones who decide what's the software going to do. Now, they're not deciding this on their own. They're consulting with the client. They're consulting with the stakeholders. They're hearing all kinds of information from the developers, but they're maintaining and developing a list of things that software has to do. And usually that's done in very non-technical language because these are non-technical people most of the time. Okay, so that's the product owner. They are the business people, but within the development team. Scrum Master represents the Scrum framework within the team. They are the embodiment of Scrum. Scrum Master, you don't think of them as a manager because they're not a manager. This is something that's hard for some people who are used to hierarchical company organizations to get used to. This is why it takes a long time to convince a big corporation to switch to an Agile or Scrum-oriented development process. They're so used to doing things with managers on top of managers on top of managers on top of managers, bossing everyone below them around. This is not a management position. This is just a regular developer usually. Sometimes it's a developer whose only focus is being the Scrum Master, but usually it's just one of the developers who is either not doing development tasks this time around on this project, but sometimes does it on other projects, or sometimes it's someone else, but it's usually a developer who is a Scrum Master. But they usually act in that role and only in that role. They usually do not also do development on the project if they are the Scrum Master, but you can mix and match those two. So the Scrum Master ensures that the team is following the Scrum framework. Remember that the Scrum framework dictates there are particular roles that everybody plays. There are particular events that take place. There are particular artifacts that have to be produced at certain times. And the Scrum Master's job is to make sure that that is all being achieved. The people are playing the right roles, the events that are supposed to happen are happening at the right times, and the things that are supposed to be produced, those artifacts, are actually being produced at the right time. That's their only job. They don't manage people, but they notify them or remind them of how this all is supposed to work, because it's very easy to just do your ad hoc development, the way you're comfortable doing it. But no, we're trying to follow Scrum, and you have to kind of shepherd the team in that correct direction. But if things go haywire and the project goes off the rails and nobody's following Scrum correctly, it is the Scrum Master's job to notify the higher up powers that be that this is the case, that they need help, that something's gone wrong, the project is not going according to Scrum. It's not their job to start to boss people around and tell them you have to follow Scrum. Yes, you can remind the team as Scrum Master, no, we're supposed to be doing this meeting this way, not this other way, because this way is the way that Scrum says to do meetings. Or, no, you're not supposed to be acting like a product owner, you're the developer, right? So you can remind people gently of the roles, of the processes, the events, the artifacts, but it's not ultimately the Scrum Master's job to manage those people. If there's a management problem and people need managing, that's where the other people in an organization, the management of an organization, come in, people external to the team. Developers implement the work laid out by the product owner. So that's it. They look at the list of features that the product owner is keeping. Remember, the product owner is keeping a list of features, and they work on them one by one and try and knock them off, finish them. Developers collaborate with the product owner to properly define and scope the work, right? So the product owner, as somebody who's not thinking in technical terms, who's thinking in client business terms, often is not having in their head the difficulty of any one of these features that they're keeping a list of. Their job is just to make that list, not to understand how hard it is to do those features. So let's say that chart for the wealth management team at Chase, right? How hard is that? They have no idea. So it's the developers who have to chime in and say, oh, that one you're asking us to do, that one's really hard, but this other one is super easy, right? So to come up with an estimation of work, the amount of effort required to achieve any of those tasks that the product owner is listing. That's the job of the developers in tandem with the product owner. So there'll be actually events, meetings, where they all get together and decide how much effort these things really are. Developers are, in theory, autonomous and decide in what manner to do the work on their own, meaning without interference from the stakeholders, from the product owner, from the Scrum Master. Developers are supposed to be their own bosses, in the sense that they're told what to make, they're told what the features are, but it's up to them to decide how to go and do that work-wise. How are they going to work together? Are they all working at home? Are they working in their pajamas in bed? Are they doing it at night rather than the day? Are they meeting at noon or at 2 p.m. every day? That's all their choice. So this is similar to in the work world today. You have often full-time employees versus contract employees or consultants. Very often, full-time employees of a company have to show up at work at a certain time, have to show up at a certain location. I mean, unless there's coronavirus, have to do work in a specified way once they're at work. Whereas independent contractors, which are not full-time employees of a company, but are hired consultants or hired contractors, they can do the work however they want. So in a sense, developers are in theory, autonomous in this sense. Now, in practice, there's lots of pressure to do work in particular ways by the other people on the team. But in theory, this is the goal, autonomy. All right, stakeholders. Stakeholders are people external to the team who have an important voice. This is the key concept here. They're the ones who can sing your praises, but also bring you down if you're a developer. So stakeholders could be the client, meaning the people in the company you're making your work for, or executives in the development company itself. Let's say you're in a tech company. That could be executives, bosses of yours, but external to your development team. Stakeholders, this is really the main thing that Scrum tries to address, is that stakeholders can cause problems if not kept in close communication with the team. What you don't want to have happen is your client agrees with you that you're going to develop this wealth management dashboard for them. You agree on some specification in the beginning, and then months, maybe years go by, and you finally finish the thing, and you go and show your client, Chase Bank Wealth Management Department, what you did. The last thing you want is them to say, actually, you know what, that's not what we wanted. That doesn't look at all like what we agreed on. Can you go back and do it again? Or you don't want them to say a year later or 2 years later, because sometimes projects take that long. You don't want them to come back and say, well, since we first agreed to do it this way, our business has changed a little bit. Now we need that thing to be done a little bit differently. Can we now go and do it a little bit differently, right? So you don't want this big gap between when you first start working on the project and when you deliver the project and have no other contact with your client in between beginning and end, which is what actually the waterfall model usually is like. You agree on a giant specification up in the beginning. Giant specification document says every little thing of what's going to be built. The developers go and build it. And then a year later, they show up with their finished work, and the client is almost always unhappy. And it almost always doesn't work properly. So the idea here with Scrum and with Agile development in general is this close collaboration between the development team and the client and the other stakeholders. So everyone is always, if they want to be, knowledgeable about what the other is doing. Clients can see what the developers are doing. Developers can see what the product owner is doing. Stakeholders of other kinds can see what everyone else is doing as well. So there's this idea of kind of transparency and real-time collaboration on everybody who's involved in a project, rather than this show up once in the beginning, show up at the end client kind of situation.
I had a quick question about the product. It was
product owner.
Owner, yeah. I'm inclined to say manager because I always hear that. But do they typically? You might have mentioned this, but do they typically have like any experience with like development or?
So Scrum defines seven. I'm calling the ritualistic events for different purposes. It's not that complicated. 7 might sound like a large number, but it's not that much. Backlog creation, sprint planning, daily Scrum, backlog grooming, sprint review, stakeholder demos, and team retrospective. Let's discuss just very briefly what each of these are. Each of these is. So backlog creation is the creation of the list of features. This is the product owner creating the list of features that they think the product has to have. Remember, they don't do this in isolation. They do this in consultation with the client, consultation with the stakeholders, reading documents, right? They aggregate all the opinions and information all around them to develop a list of features that the product has to have. We'll talk exactly how that works in a second. That's at the beginning of a project. Before you can even work on the project, you have to know what you're doing, and that's essentially the list of features of what you're supposed to build. Sprint planning, then the development team gets together and decides, okay, well, how are we going to approach this? We have this giant list of features. What can we do? Which of those can we start to work on? Daily Scrum, every single day, the developers get together and discuss what's going on. What went on, what happened yesterday, what's happening today, what's going to happen tomorrow. They're just getting a sense of where the progress is going of this project. In the middle of what we call a sprint, in the middle of an iterative quantity of work, there's this idea that the backlog, which is a fancy word for the set of features of the product, the backlog might need grooming, might need some refining. You might discover, midway through working on a bunch of features that they require other features that weren't listed in the backlog, for example, right? So you might discover that there are missing features that should be there, really. You might start working on some features and realize they don't make any sense, and you might just want to get rid of them. So that would also fall into here. So this is kind of midpoint through a scope of work. You realize that the specification, which is really what the backlog is, needs some adjusting, and you do whatever tweaks are necessary. Now, I mean the product owner is responsible for the backlog. They're responsible for the list of features of the product, but they will get together with the rest of the team, continually discussing this, and they'll figure out which features need to be added, which need to be removed, which need to be clarified further. That's what this middle of the sprint, middle of the work process is all about. At the end of a sprint, at the end of a scope of work, there is a review. It's getting together with the whole team and discussing where we are. It's actually a preparation for the stakeholder demo. So at the end of every sprint, at the end of every scope of work that you've planned out, you show the stakeholders where you are. It won't be, the whole project's not done. You're just doing one iteration, one part of a project, but you show it to the stakeholders and get their feedback. And then you hold this retrospective where you get the whole team together, including the product owner, and you discuss, what went well, what went poorly, what can we do better next time, how do we make this work better from here on out. So that's the big picture idea. These are all the steps, the 7 different steps, the events that happen within one single incremental piece of work. So let's talk about this in a little more detail. Here's a simple diagram I made for giving you a sense of a project. And this is the whole sprint project, the whole Scrum project in one diagram. At the very beginning, before anything else, there has to be this backlog creation, right? This list of features has to be drafted by the product owner. Then this next box here in this timeline is a sprint of work, right? You've got developers working in sprints. You don't have them work on the whole project. You have them work on just one chunk of work. You're going to have a sprint planning meeting. Your team is going to get together. You're going to look at the list of features that was drafted earlier by the product owner, and you're going to decide which of those do you think is suitable for working now. So you're going to select a subset of the backlog, a subset of those features to work on in this particular incremental set of work. Your whole team agrees on that. You've picked the features you think are the best to start with, whatever those might be, and you're going to work on them. You start implementation. At the middle of the sprint, you're going to look at the list of features and you're going to refine it. You're going to realize there are features that weren't there that should have been there. You're going to realize that there are some features that are there that you don't really need anymore. Some features need more clarification because you don't even know what they mean. And you're going to work with the product owner to refine that list of features. You're not changing what you're working on in this sprint, but you're refining what will be then picked from next sprint in the sprint planning meeting next time. So you're just fixing up this backlog, fixing any problems in it, so that with the beginning of the next sprint, you're kind of in a better place. But anyway, you're continuing to work on what you picked this sprint for the product features. Towards the end, right before the very end, you do a review internally, just figure out where you are. You present where you are to the stakeholders, and you do it after that, a retrospective. Maybe you got yelled at by some VIP customers, right? You get together and kind of and recuperate from that, right? So this can be a stressful demo if your team is not performing well. And or it could be a very rewarding demo where everything is going perfectly well and you just feel great. So at the end of that, the team retrospective is really your embrace of where you are or your kind of denial of where you are, and you try as a team to figure out how you can do it better next time. So those are the 7 steps. That's it. And you're done after a certain number of sprints. Now, how many sprints does it take to finish a project? Well, it all depends how much time you have. If you're working for a client, you would agree with the client up front how many sprints they can afford to hire you for. And you stop when the money runs out. That's essentially what it is. Or you negotiate a new contract, right? So that's the big picture idea. Let's go through each one of these things in a little more detail, although I've mentioned a good amount of them. So the backlog is a list of features that's, remember, at the beginning of the project. The first thing you do as product owner, you organize the development of the backlog, the list of features. They're not written in just any style. I apologize for my extra S here, but they're not written in just any style. They are written as what they call user stories. What is a user story? So this is a feature, but it's written in a particular style. The user story is written as a single sentence like this. As a something, I want to something, so that something. That's it. So imagine, again, my imaginary Chase Wealth Management. I don't know why I'm focused on them, but let's say you're working with Chase Wealth Management to make that dashboard so investors can see where they are. You would say and you think of your user. Who is your user? This wealth management customer. So you think, okay, as a wealthy person, I want to look at my overall balances for all accounts so that I know how much I can invest in something new. You don't make this up out of air. You actually talk to end users. You talk to the customers, the VIP stakeholders. You meet with them. You discuss what they want out of the software with them. You meet with the client. You discuss what they want out of the software. You meet with your boss. Your boss informs you of what they want in the software, right? So you meet with as many stakeholders as you can, preferably at least some from all different groups of stakeholders. And as a result of that, you have a sense of what this project needs to do for its customers, and that's where these things come from. So you use your intuition as well as your feedback you've gotten from stakeholders to make a list of sentences like this that really describe everything that the software has to do for its users. So in the first spot here, you enter in a role. In the case of, let's say, this wealth management imaginary client, there might be a couple different kinds of users who are using this software. There might be the software that the Chase employees who are wealth management managers, they themselves look at. There might be another screen in this same software product that the actual clients themselves, the wealthy people, can look at, right? So there might be a couple different things. So you might have a set of features for the Chase employees that is different from the set of features you need for the actual end users, and you would make user stories for both camps. So usually there's more than one kind of user for any given software. Let's say that you are, I don't know, you're Amazon.com, and you're building out your shop, your online shop. You've got a whole bunch of different kinds of users, right? You've got users just who want to buy something on Amazon, do a search and find something and hit add to cart, right? That's one set of users, your end users. You've also got Amazon staff who need to sometimes update product listings or update categories of products or recategorize incorrectly categorized products. You've also got delivery people who are, needing to check in with information from the Amazon databases through some software. So you've got a whole world of different kinds of users in the world of any sophisticated operation. So each, you'd come up with user stories for each kind of person, and you'd fill in for any one of these sentences which kind of those users are you talking about in this spot here. The second blank is filled with your goal. This is what you want to be able to achieve. I want to see all my balances in one view with your wealth management software, right? And then the third spot is your justification or your reason. Why is that of use to you, right? So we need to get our heads around what the user is thinking. So we put in a little blurb here so that I can know how much I need to invest or how much I have available to invest in some other products. So, so you want to get a sense of who they are, what they want, and why they want it. All right, so these are non-technical. You do not mention databases here, Node.js, JavaScript code, React.js. You don't put anything to do with technology in these stories. These are written in imaginary user language. So you think of your client, you think of how they talk, and you write these in a sentence as if it's coming out of their mouth. One way to think about user stories, there are many people who give you kind of best practices in user stories, but invest sounds easy, so I use that one. Independent user stories should be independent of one another. So in one user story, you shouldn't reference another user story. Like, I want to be able to see all my balances and all my investments so that I can meet the requirements in user story number 12. You don't want to do something like that. It should be an independent, self-contained sentence that anyone can understand without looking up any other further documentation. Negotiable. Any user story is up in the air. Is it really something you need to do? You're going to have to, in a Scrum project, decide on a prioritization of features. Some are going to be more important than others. You can't do them all. It's not really reasonable to say that you're going to do all your features. You're going to have to prioritize them and cut off some. So at any point, you could chop off one of your user stories. They should be meaningful, valuable, so they should be useful. And there should be a reason why you're including them, not just because the professor told you to make 12 user stories, but they should actually add some value to the project. They should be estimable. Developers should be able to get together and think of, is that a big task? Is that a small task? Is that a medium-sized task? Or some other way of judging effort. If the user story is so vague that you can't really understand if it's a lot of work or not, then you haven't written the user story in a specific enough language. So it should be specific enough that somebody could get their head around whether that's going to be a lot of work or a little bit of work or something. So very often you find in your product grooming, let's just go back to that chart for a second, when you're looking at the backlog in the middle of a given chunk of work and you're reviewing what's in the backlog and making sure it all makes sense, you'll often find that your user stories were written in a too vague of a language, and you need to actually make them more specific so that developers can really get their heads around how much work it's going to be. Small. The user story should be small enough to be completed in one sprint. You get the hang of that as you go, but you don't want massively complex user stories that are going to require a whole year or even a month to finish. You want them digestible, doable in a single sprint, and testable. You should be able to, at the end of your work, say that you did that or not. right? That you achieved what that story was intending for you to achieve in development work. So again, it should be clear enough, like the estimable idea, it should be clear enough that you can actually say you did that, that it's something you can check off of your checklist once you're done. User stories should have a couple extra things. So primarily they're just those one sentences. As a blank, I want to blank, so I blank. There are some additional bits of information you can throw into a user story. So there are two things that I want you to add in ours, which are acceptance criteria. This represents the minimum requirements for the user story to be considered done. Write that however you want, but there should be some idea of minimally acceptable work that would match this user story. A quick one-line sentence of what you think needs to be done. That's something that the product owner and the developers would come up with in their discussions. You'll see as we go, you'll see how that works. User stories also have an estimation of effort. And this is something that the developers have to do. This is not something that the product owner would have any idea about. So the developers have to get together, and there are, as we saw, there are particular events in Scrum, and at the sprint planning meeting is actually the event where this happens. The developers look through the product backlog in the beginning of the sprint, in the sprint planning phase, the very first event in the sprint, and they discuss each of the user stories. They ask questions of the product owner explains what it's all about. And one of the things the developers have to do collaboratively with each other is decide how much work that's going to be. Is that a lot, a little, a medium, or some other way? So there are various techniques, various games that developers play to decide collaboratively how much work they think something's going to be. Because of course, every developer might have a different view of how much work it is, right? So planning poker is one that I think is worthwhile to pursue. It's probably the most common way of estimating work. So really what this is every developer has a pack of cards. And I don't know if I have the outline here. No, every developer has a pack of cards. You can look this up, instructions online pretty easily. But every developer has a pack of cards with not just regular cards with aces 1, 2, 3, or aces 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like regular card deck. This is, of course, for developers, a Fibonacci sequence deck. Every card is, so every number in the Fibonacci sequence is the sum of the numbers before it, right? So 0 is the first number, 1 plus 0 is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8. The nice thing about the Fibonacci sequence is that the space between numbers, the consecutive numbers, gets larger as the sequence goes on, right? So the space between the early numbers in the Fibonacci sequence is either 0 or very small. And as the sequence goes forward, as you get more and more numbers in the sequence, the gap between the numbers gets bigger and bigger. And this matches how people think that we are able to estimate. If you're asked to estimate how difficult something is, the larger the task is, the harder it is for you to differentiate between, super, 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 super large amount of effort or just super, super, super a large amount of effort, right? Can you really tell the difference between those two things? Probably not. So the granularity of the estimations is probably more meaningful at the lower end of difficulty, and the granularity is not important at the upper level of difficulty. So that's why it makes sense to have gaps in your estimations of larger order higher up that list than at lower. There are other techniques, one of which is, I believe, popular at Amazon.com, for which I've done some work myself. Although I've never worked in a team that did this. I've worked in my own teams that I, outside of Amazon, built software for them. But I understand inside of Amazon, they often use a t-shirt sizing method for estimating effort, which is any user story is either large, medium, or small. So they keep it simple. Spikes. Sometimes there is work that is not end user facing. So sometimes you have internal stuff you just have to do to get a project done or to help be able to get the project done. Like you have to set up working environments, set up machines with the right software to do development on them, set up databases, set up servers, or you have to do a lot of infrastructure operational stuff. Even as you're working on a project, you'll see that stuff pops up every now and then. So these are not user stories. User stories are focused on users' desires for the software. Remember, that's the goal of a user story is, as a certain kind of user, I want this thing so I can do that other. Spikes don't fit in there. Spike is a non-user facing, usually something technical or just internal to the team. Like a spike might be buy Gatorade for all the developers, right? Something that has nothing to do with the end user using that software. And sometimes you want to put those in your project plan as well. You want to make sure that that's listed as work because it is work. Anything that you're working on to get a project done is work. And our goal is to enumerate every little thing that involves work. So a spike is a work that is not user-facing. In Scrum, work is divided up into increments called sprints, and sprints typically last several weeks. As I mentioned, 4, 6 are not uncommon. So you don't work on the whole project at once. You work on one chunk of work, which we call a sprint. At the start of the sprint, the team gets together and decides what features to work on in this sprint. That's the sprint planning meeting. The product owner represents or presents the list of user stories in the backlog from top to bottom. The product owner has actually ordered the list with the user stories that are of most importance to the business. So as a business-focused team member, that is what's on the product owner's head, is what are the goals of the business, and they order that list of features of user stories so that the most important ones to the business are at the top. So from top to bottom, the whole team gets together and runs through the user stories, and the team discusses and agrees on which ones to do first. It doesn't have to be the ones at the top. There might be some at the top that are really hard and require a lot of work, and the estimation of effort shows that it's a lot of work. So you might mix and match some really hard, big user stories with some really simple, small user stories. And you can only do that if you have an estimation of effort, which you do from planning poker. Developers break up each user story into discrete tasks. So what is a task? So a user story is a vague sort of user-facing statement. As a wealth management manager, I want to see a list of my clients so I can contact them weekly. That's all great, but what do you actually have to build, right? So the developers take that user story and then divide it up into smaller tasks that together would complete that user story. What do you have to do? Okay, you have to build an interface. You've got to build a connection to a database that pulls the names of your customers. You've got to make sure the email addresses show up. You've got to have a button to click to be able to email any of those people. You know, I'm making this up, right? But some kind of a broken out idea of actually development work that would have to be done to achieve that user story. So these are called tasks. Some of them might be spikes. Set up the database, set up the server, right? So some will be spikes, which are not tasks. They're separate things, but similar. But what we're talking about here is just the tasks, right? What are the discrete units of work that would have to be done to achieve that given user story? The way to decide whether your tasks are suitable or not for what we're calling Scrum is that it should take one developer about 1 day to achieve each of your tasks, right? So if you see that one of your tasks seems like a lot of work that might take a couple days, well, break it up into 2 tasks. Right? That's how you know that you need to break it up into a finer, more granular level of detail. You get better at this as you do it, of course. So your estimations will be off in the beginning, I'm sure, wildly. You're going to think something's going to take you 1 day when in fact it'll take you 4 weeks, right? You're going to get it all wrong, but you're going to get better and better at this as you work on it. Okay, so this is the sprint planning meeting. So product owner reads through the list of user stories. Developers and product owner chat about them, make sure everyone understands them. Developers go and estimate how much work each one is. And then they decide together which ones of these they want to do. And the developers go and chop that up into tasks so that they know exactly what each developer is going to be working on in small single chunks, multiple chunks, but small chunks of work called tasks. All right, so they all discuss what they're going to do. And these are added, the user stories that they've agreed to do on this sprint, on this first incremental piece of work, go into what's called the sprint backlog, not the product backlog, which is the whole list of features that the whole product is going to be achieving, but just the features that this particular chunk of work will be achieving. All right, so that's the idea there. They break it up and they do it in 1 day, each task, and each task gets assigned to a specific developer. So everyone should know who's doing what. So again, once each user story has been broken up into its tasks, just make sure that every single one of those tasks is assigned to somebody. No tasks in a sprint should just be unclaimed. Developers get to work and do their business. All right, every day the team gets together and discusses what's going on. What have you done since last time? What are you doing now? Is there anything blocking your progress? Every team member has to answer that one after the other. And of course, the Scrum Master, being the manager of ceremonies here, the master of ceremonies, the Scrum Master makes sure that this meeting is being followed correctly. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. What are you doing? What did you do last time? What are you doing now? Anything in your way that you need me to help with? All right. So there's these 3 questions. In these 3 questions, you find out what everyone on your team is working on and if there are any problems that they're having, right? And if you notice that the same team member is doing the same things every day, then you have a problem, right? Because each task is supposed to be done in a day. So every day there should be new things that each member is working on. And if that's not happening, then your team is not functioning correctly and you need to notify the management. Actually, if things are not working correctly, you do two things. First, you try and resolve it internally. You try and figure out, if your team is able to solve a problem on its own. And if that's not solvable, or the solution you're trying to work out as a team fails within a day or two, you seek help from your bosses. All right. In the middle of the sprint, as we mentioned, you get together as a team and discuss what's going on with the product backlog. And we discussed this already, but the product backlog just gets groomed, it gets refined, new features added, old features removed. But this doesn't affect the current sprint. Nothing that you're doing in this meeting, in this event, is affecting what you're working on in this sprint. It's all about just fixing up the backlog. So next sprint, your backlog is in better shape. At the end, the team gets together and discusses what has been done. And the team agrees what to show the stakeholders. Remember, the next thing after this is a stakeholder demo. So the team kind of is preparing for the demo here. What did we do that's worth showing, that is done enough to show, and they show the stakeholders in the next event what actually was done. So the team demonstrates the work to the stakeholders. The product owner is often the leader of that demo because they're the client-facing head of the project. Stakeholders give feedback, suggestions. They might request things that seem totally unreasonable, but that's their prerogative. And you discuss with the people who are interested in your software how it's going, what you did, and whether they have any feedback on it. Often there are new user stories that pop up in those meetings because the stakeholders might, top of their head, think of ideas that they want in this software that they never told you about before. And you go and you add those into the product backlog at that point. The product owner, of course, does that. At the end, you discuss how it went. Did it go well? Did it go poorly? How can we improve for next time?